Jacob Fatu and Jimmy Uso just made the most shocking and terrifying return in WWE history by attacking Drew McIntyre backstage in an assault so brutal and so coordinated that Drew is now in the hospital with injuries that include a broken jaw, shattered orbital bone, and internal damage that required emergency surgery. And the most chilling part is that Jacob and Jimmy showed zero remorse as they stood over Drew's bloody body and promised that this was just the beginning of the revenge they're going to inflict on everyone who hurt them and their family. These aren't the same men who left WWE broken and hospitalized months ago. Jacob returned from his career-threatening knee injury looking like an absolute monster who was hungrier and more vicious than ever, and Jimmy returned from Drew's parking lot assault with visible scars on his face and a look in his eyes that shows he's abandoned any sense of mercy or restraint. When I reveal what Jacob and Jimmy did to Drew that was so graphic WWE had to cut all the cameras and physically pull them off before they killed him, when I show you the message they spray-painted on the wall next to Drew's unconscious body that promises more attacks are coming, and when I explain why Roman Reigns is reportedly terrified of what Jacob and Jimmy have become because even he can't control them anymore, you're going to realize that SmackDown just became a war zone and that Drew McIntyre's campaign of destruction against the Bloodline has created two vengeful monsters who won't stop until everyone who wronged them is destroyed. Let me take you through the events leading to this explosive return because understanding what Jacob Fatu and Jimmy Uso went through during their time away makes their thirst for revenge not just understandable but absolutely inevitable. Jacob Fatu was attacked backstage months ago in an assault that destroyed his knee and forced him to undergo reconstructive surgery that doctors said might end his wrestling career before it really began. Jacob spent months in agonizing rehabilitation, working through physical therapy that pushed his body to its limits, all while watching the person responsible for his attack continue to terrorize his family without facing any real consequences. Jimmy Uso suffered even worse at Drew McIntyre's hands, getting brutally assaulted in a parking garage with a steel pipe in an attack so vicious that Jimmy suffered a fractured skull, broken ribs, internal bleeding, and was left fighting for his life in intensive care for days. Jimmy's recovery was long and painful, and he's left with permanent scars on his face and head that serve as constant reminders of what Drew did to him. But more than the physical scars, Jimmy carries psychological trauma from being attacked while defenseless and from coming so close to death that doctors told his family to prepare for the worst. During their respective recoveries, Jacob and Jimmy apparently stayed in contact despite being on different brands and despite the Bloodline's internal politics and conflicts. They bonded over their shared experience of being victims of Drew's campaign of violence, and they made a pact that when they were both healthy enough to return, they would come back together and they would make everyone who hurt them pay. They trained together during their rehab, pushing each other through the pain and the setbacks, and they planned their revenge down to the smallest detail, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came on last night's SmackDown, and what Jacob and Jimmy did shows they spent their time away learning how to be more brutal and more effective than they were before their injuries. The attack happened approximately 90 minutes into the SmackDown broadcast, during a segment where Drew McIntyre was backstage cutting a promo about his dominance and his continued mission to destroy the Bloodline. Drew was alone in a hallway corridor, no security nearby, completely confident and unaware that he was about to become the victim of the same kind of ambush violence that he had inflicted on others. The first sign that something was wrong came when the lights in that corridor suddenly went out, plunging the area into complete darkness. Drew's voice could be heard on the audio saying "what the hell," and there was maybe 3 seconds of confused darkness before the emergency backup lights kicked in. But by the time those dim lights came on, Jacob Fatu and Jimmy Uso were already on Drew, having used those few seconds of darkness to close the distance without being seen or stopped. The footage that WWE's cameras captured, the parts that actually made it to broadcast before they cut away, showed Jacob delivering a devastating superkick that caught Drew completely off guard and sent him stumbling backward into the wall. Before Drew could recover or defend himself, Jimmy hit him with a running knee to the face that immediately opened a cut above Drew's eye and started blood flowing. But those initial strikes were just the setup for what became one of the most vicious and sustained beatdowns in SmackDown history. Jacob and Jimmy worked with disturbing coordination, taking turns delivering strikes while the other positioned Drew for the next attack. Jacob would hold Drew while Jimmy hit him with knees to the ribs and face. Jimmy would position Drew against the wall while Jacob delivered brutal chops and forearms. They were operating like a tag team that had been working together for years, which in fact they had been before their injuries, but this wasn't the traditional tag team wrestling you see in matches. This was calculated violence designed to inflict maximum damage. According to eyewitnesses who arrived on the scene within the first minute of the attack, Jacob and Jimmy had brought weapons with them, specifically a steel chain and a pair of brass knuckles that WWE officials later confiscated as evidence. Jacob reportedly wrapped the chain around his fist and delivered multiple punches to Drew's body and face, with each impact making a sickening thud that echoed down the hallway. Jimmy used the brass knuckles to target Drew's jaw and orbital bone, the same areas that Drew had damaged when he attacked Jimmy months ago, delivering what doctors are calling retaliatory injuries that perfectly mirror what Jimmy suffered. The attack lasted approximately 2 minutes before WWE officials, security personnel, and other wrestlers arrived to break it up, but in those 2 minutes Jacob and Jimmy inflicted catastrophic damage. Drew was left unconscious in a pool of his own blood, his face completely swollen and disfigured from the beating, his body covered in welts and bruises from the chain strikes. Medical personnel who reached Drew immediately called for an ambulance and began treating what they recognized as potentially life-threatening injuries. But here's what makes this attack even more chilling and shows the psychological warfare aspect of Jacob and Jimmy's revenge. Before they were pulled away from Drew's body, the two men spray-painted a message on the wall in large red letters that said "Eye for an eye. We're just getting started." That message, that promised that this attack was only the beginning of the revenge they planned to exact, has everyone in WWE from management to the roster to the fans absolutely terrified about what comes next and who else might be targeted. When Jacob and Jimmy were finally separated from Drew and led away by security, eyewitnesses report that both men were laughing and showed absolutely no remorse or concern about the consequences of what they just did. Jimmy reportedly said to one of the security guards, "Drew thought he could attack us and there would be no payback? He's lucky we didn't kill him." Jacob added, "This is what happens when you mess with the wrong people. Drew wanted war. Now he's got it." The medical update on Drew McIntyre's condition is serious and has put him on the shelf indefinitely with injuries that will require multiple surgeries and months of recovery. Drew suffered a fractured jaw in 2 places that will need to be wired shut for weeks. His orbital bone was shattered, the same injury he inflicted on others, requiring reconstructive surgery to repair and potentially affecting his vision long-term. Multiple ribs were cracked from the chain strikes. He has a severe concussion from the repeated blows to his head. And most concerning, doctors discovered internal bleeding in his abdomen that required emergency surgery to repair damaged organs. The surgeon who operated on Drew gave a statement. "Mr. McIntyre suffered extensive injuries from what appears to be a sustained and brutal physical assault. We've addressed the immediate threats to his life, but he faces a long recovery process with multiple additional surgeries needed to repair facial fractures and other damage. It will be months before he can even consider returning to any kind of physical activity, and there may be permanent effects from some of these injuries." WWE's official response to this attack has been swift and severe, but in a way that shows the company is struggling with how to handle this situation. WWE released a statement saying, "Jacob Fatu and Jimmy Uso have been indefinitely suspended for their unprovoked attack on Drew McIntyre. WWE does not condone violence outside of sanctioned matches, and both superstars will face serious consequences, including potential termination depending on the outcome of our investigation and any legal proceedings." But here's where WWE's response becomes complicated and reveals the moral ambiguity of this situation. Many people within WWE and many fans are arguing that Jacob and Jimmy's attack wasn't unprovoked as the statement claims. Drew McIntyre attacked both of them first in brutal ambushes that put them in hospitals and nearly ended their careers. Drew has spent months terrorizing the bloodline with increasingly violent and dangerous tactics. From a certain perspective, what Jacob and Jimmy did was justified retaliation, an eye for an eye as their message stated, giving Drew a taste of his own medicine. This moral complexity is creating division within WWE and among fans about whether Jacob and Jimmy should be punished or whether they should be celebrated for finally standing up to Drew's bullying and violence. The hashtags trending on social media are split between hashtag justice for Drew from people who think Jacob and Jimmy went too far, and hashtag karma caught Drew from people who believe Drew got exactly what he deserved and that Jacob and Jimmy were right to seek revenge in this manner. Roman Reigns' response to Jacob and Jimmy's return and their brutal attack on Drew is fascinating and reveals tension within the bloodline about methods and control. Roman appeared on SmackDown later in the show and addressed what Jacob and Jimmy did, saying, "I want to be clear about something. What Jacob Fatu and Jimmy Uso did tonight, they did on their own. They didn't ask for my permission. They didn't coordinate with me. They acted independently because they have their own grievances with Drew McIntyre. Now, do I understand why they did it? Absolutely. Drew has been attacking my family for months. But the way they did it, the lack of strategic thinking, the impulsiveness, that concerns me because it brings heat on the entire bloodline." That statement from Roman trying to distance himself from Jacob and Jimmy's actions while also somewhat defending their motivation shows that Roman is worried about losing control of his family members. Jacob and Jimmy operating independently, not asking for permission, taking matters into their own hands, that represents a threat to Roman's authority as tribal chief. If other bloodline members start acting on their own impulses rather than following Roman's leadership, the faction becomes chaotic and unpredictable in ways that could be dangerous for everyone. But here's the thing, Jacob and Jimmy apparently don't care about Roman's concerns or his authority anymore. According to Backstage sources, when Roman confronted them about the attack and told them they should have consulted him first, Jimmy reportedly told Roman, "You weren't there when Drew almost killed me in that parking garage. You didn't protect me. So don't tell me how I should handle getting revenge on the man who nearly ended my life. This is personal between me and Drew, and Jacob feels the same way. We're handling our business our way, and you can either support us or get out of our way." That defiance, that willingness to challenge Roman's authority directly, shows how much Jimmy and Jacob have changed during their time away. They're not the loyal soldiers who followed orders anymore. They're traumatized men seeking revenge and willing to burn down everything, including their relationship with Roman, if that's what it takes to get justice. This transformation makes them more dangerous but also more unpredictable and potentially more volatile in ways that could create problems beyond just their feud with Drew. Uso's reaction to his brother Jimmy returning with Jacob to attack Drew has been supportive but also concerned. G has his own issues with Drew after what Drew did to Jimmy, and G was preparing for his own revenge match against Drew before Jacob and Jimmy's return. But now G is worried that his brother has crossed lines and become someone consumed by vengeance in ways that might be self-destructive. G posted on social media, "I'm glad my brother is back and I'm glad Drew got what he deserved. But Jimmy, Jacob, please don't let revenge consume you to the point where you lose yourselves. Drew isn't worth sacrificing who you are as people." The question of what legal consequences Jacob Fatu and Jimmy Uso might face for their attack on Drew is serious and could result in criminal charges. What they did clearly constitutes assault with deadly weapons, the chain and brass knuckles, and Drew's injuries are severe enough to elevate charges to aggravated assault or even attempted murder depending on how prosecutors evaluate the evidence. Drew would have strong grounds to press charges, though doing so would open him up to counterarguments about his own previous attacks on Jacob and Jimmy that started this cycle of violence. WWE's legal team is reportedly nervous about this situation because the company could face liability for workplace violence and for failing to provide adequate security to prevent this attack. Drew could argue that WWE knew Jacob and Jimmy had motivations to attack him and should have provided protection or kept them separated. The insurance carriers are already investigating, and there are concerns about potential lawsuits that could cost WWE millions regardless of how the criminal case proceeds. The wrestling community's response has been passionate and deeply divided. Legends like Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock have weighed in with opinions about whether revenge violence is ever justified and about the line between wrestling storytelling and real violence. Current wrestlers are split between those who believe Jacob and Jimmy crossed ethical lines and those who believe Drew created this situation through his own actions and has no right to complain about facing consequences. The upcoming direction for this storyline is unclear because WWE now has multiple injured parties in a situation that has escalated beyond what typical wrestling storylines allow for. Drew is out of action for months. Jacob and Jimmy are suspended but clearly not sorry for what they did and are promising more attacks. Roman is trying to maintain control of a situation that's spiraling beyond his ability to manage. And there are other Bloodline members and Drew's allies who might get pulled into this conflict and become victims of the ongoing violence. One possibility is that WWE books a massive multi-person match like War Games where all parties can settle their differences in a controlled environment with rules and referees to prevent things from becoming too dangerous. Another possibility is that WWE leans into the chaos and lets this become a guerrilla warfare storyline where attacks happen randomly and unpredictably, creating genuine tension about who's safe and who's next. The third possibility is that WWE tries to de-escalate by having authority figures impose consequences and separating the involved parties to protect everyone's safety. The emotional weight of this storyline is what makes it so compelling and so controversial. These aren't just characters playing roles. Jacob Fatu really was injured and went through months of painful rehabilitation. Jimmy Uso really was hospitalized with life-threatening injuries. Drew McIntyre really has been portrayed as a bully who attacks people in vulnerable situations. The lines between fiction and reality are blurred in ways that make audiences genuinely care about what happens and genuinely invested in seeing justice served however they define it. The question of whether Jacob and Jimmy are heroes or villains in this story depends entirely on your perspective. From one angle, they're vigilantes taking justice into their own hands because the system, WWE management, failed to protect them or hold Drew accountable. From another angle, they're criminals who committed a vicious assault that could have killed someone and who are using their victimhood as an excuse for inexcusable violence. Wrestling storytelling at its best creates these morally complex situations where reasonable people can disagree about who's right and who's wrong. The long-term implications for all the characters involved are massive. Drew's career trajectory has been derailed by injuries that will take months to recover from, and when he returns he'll be returning to a situation where two men want to destroy him and have proven they're willing to cross any line to do it. Jacob and Jimmy have established themselves as forces of vengeance who won't be controlled by Roman or by WWE management, making them unpredictable and potentially dangerous to everyone around them. Roman's authority as tribal chief is being challenged in ways that could fracture the bloodline permanently. The physical toll on everyone involved is severe and raises questions about whether this level of violence is sustainable or whether WWE needs to find ways to tell compelling stories without performers actually getting seriously injured. Wrestling has always walked a line between simulated violence and real danger, but when that line gets crossed repeatedly and people end up in hospitals with career-threatening injuries, it forces everyone to examine whether the entertainment value is worth the human cost. Jacob Fatu and Jimmy